welcome to CounterPunch Radio. My name is Eric Draitzer. Thanks so much for tuning in, coming back to the show. First time listeners finding the show, welcome aboard. Always happy to have you. Hey, go over to the website, take a look at CounterPunch Plus. This is our subscriber section. This is the best way to support CounterPunch, to help keep the lights on, help keep this project going. We're coming up on 30 years now. 30 years is quite a long time for a publication on the left, and the importance of having independent left-wing platforms these days is ever more important as we see so many things seemingly changing the information landscape every week. So with that said, go over to Counterpunch Plus, get that subscription. Really appreciate it. Speaking of other ways of supporting Counterpunch, you can support us by supporting our friends. And we have one of our friends with us today, one of the, I would say, preeminent Marxist historians we have working today. He is a friend. He is a great scholar. Doug Greene is with us. Doug is the author of two important books. The one we're going to highlight here today, his brand new book, Failure of Vision, Michael Harrington and the Limits of Democratic Socialism, out, sometime around when you're listening to this conversation. I would also recommend his previous book, Communist Insurgent, Blanqui's Politics of Revolution. With that said, Doug Greene, welcome to Counterpunch Radio.
Thank you, Eric. I'm very happy to be here.
Hey, really happy to have you. And I want to commend you on this very important accomplishment. This book, I think it's a very important contribution to a lot of the discussion we have on the left. Obviously, Michael Harrington himself as an individual we'll get to, but DSA as an important organization on the constellation of the left. And hey, what is it? Where does it come from? Very important to understand this. So let's talk about Michael Harrington a little bit. Who is this, Doug? Why in the world are you, a Marxist historian, a very serious historian in your own right? Why are you spending all this time reading about, writing about, talking about Michael Harrington? Why a whole book on this man?
So, Michael Harrington is probably the most important democratic socialist figure in the latter half of the 20th century in the United States. He was an author, a public intellectual, and a political organizer. The book he's most famous for is called The Other America, which was published in the mid 60s about poverty and was very important on the Great Society. And he was also, as a political activist, he was head of the Socialist Party of America, the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, and Democratic Socialists of America. And he was their founder and leader. And the reason why I devoted so much time to Harrington is DSA is now the largest nominally socialist organization in the US since the 1940s, when the Communist Party was at its height. Roughly, last I heard, was around 100,000 members, which is so, and they exercise a very wide influence on elected, in terms of elected officials. People in political activism are often going to counter DSA, and it's worth asking and it's worth exploring how much or how little their founders' ideas still influence those politics, because and I would argue it actually casts a very long shadow over DSA.
Well, let's hold off on that for just a second and ask very quickly before we even get into that question, what is democratic socialism? I guess maybe how do people on the left understand it today? How did Harrington himself describe it? And then maybe secondarily, could you explain how that maybe differs from other interpretations of what that term means?
Sure, democratic socialism, it can it's got a wide variety of meanings, but it's generally, you say you can vote in socialism. And of course, the understanding of what the socialism means is just as important. For a lot of people who call themselves democratic socialists now, it can mean anything from like a very vigorous version of the New Deal or the Great Society, or the type of welfare state that historically existed in the Scandinavian countries. Sometimes it can mean like maybe just a non-totalitarian form of socialism, like it actually is anti-capitalist. But the key thing about the democratic socialism, generally all its varieties, is a rejection of any kind of revolutionary path to socialism. It's some kind of parliamentary, electoralist, gradualist view. And for Harrington, he did actually think that there was a future beyond capitalism. He just was very much, he thought the next step was some kind, was like Sweden or the New Deal. And so he didn't think that Sweden or the New Deal were necessarily socialist, but he thought that they were kind of like this halfway house, that like they had some state ownership and, state planning, but it was still tied to capitalism. Something else I want to kind of emphasize is a lot of this is very theoretical, but in practice, it really, it actually does make sense to use the terms democratic socialism or social democracy interchangeably, because it's very amorphous how you get from capitalism to, socialism, if you're actually talking about a post-capitalist society. Because historic, like at least since like 1914, social democracies just meant some kind of regulated capitalism and whatnot. So this meant that since Harrington did envision a post-capitalist future, but did think that the next step was social democracy, that he was quite comfortable with those politics. He actually counted as his friends many of the leaders of and presidents and prime ministers who came out of the European social democratic party. So he was friends with Franz Mitterrand, the leaders of Sweden, new members of the British Labour Party, the Israeli Labour Party as well. So for him, it really, it's like some kind of post-capitalist future was some kind of very long-term idea. One thing I will say that does differentiate Harrington from a lot of his cohorts in the Socialist International, or like these Social Democrats, is he is still describing himself as a Marxist, and he is using Marxist terminology and thinking to understand it, whereas people like Franz Mitterrand really wasn't, or the Israeli Labor Party, they really weren't interested in Marxist theory, even as some kind of abstraction. Whereas Harrington actually did try and situate his ideas within Marxism, what he called a democratic Marxism, which is the appendix of my book.
So what's the political calculus? What's the trajectory? I mean, does Harrington formulate these ideas and the language around these ideas as a direct result of these sort of anti-communist movements of the late 40s and early 50s, that he comes out of that and tries to sanitize left-wing thinking and socialism, or is this something that is uniquely American in his view? How did he arrive to this kind of distillation of his version of socialism?
Sure. So he's actually has a very interesting history. He starts out politically, actually, with like the Catholic worker movement of Dorothea Day, which is kind of this left wing Catholicism. And he eventually joins the Socialist Party of Norman Thomas in the early 50s. And later, in like 52, 54, around then, he joins what the uh, Independent Socialist League, which is led by Max Shachtman. And Shachtman is who I argue is his most important political mentor. Shachtman was someone who was a founder of the Communist Party USA, a leading Trotskyist. He actually was at the founding convention of the Fourth International in 1938. But after 1940, Shachtman broke with Trotsky, and he kind of saw the Soviet Union as this evil empire of bureaucratic collectivism. And by the time Harrington is aligning with Shachtman is pretty much openly coming to see the U.S. as a lesser evil, and the communists as hell bent on world domination. So Harrington is adopting a lot of Shachtman's ideas, particularly on how he characterizes the Soviet Union. Even after Harrington breaks with Shachtman, he dedicates one of his books to him. So the influence is long lasting. And Shachtman develops a lot of the ideas that Harrington, not just on understanding the Soviet Union, but on orienting towards labor officialdom, who are anti communist, on orienting toward the Democratic Party. And I think so. It's not like Harrington originates this, he picks this up from Max Shachtman. But I think Harrington does kind of refine it and really develop it into a full blown strategy and worldview, whereas Shachtman is still kind of working his way there. And furthermore, Harrington is he is very much in line with like a lot of, again, like democratic socialists around the world at this time, where a lot of the founding members of NATO states in 1948 were led by social democratic parties, which were explicitly declaring themselves, we are democratic socialists, not totalitarian communists. And Harrington is very much in line with that milieu. And you could kind of see this, a lot of the figures he associates with, like the New York intellectuals, they're very much involved with like the Congress of Cultural Freedom. Norman Thomas was like getting CIA money. Now, I want to emphasize that Harrington himself, there's no evidence that he was involved with the CIA or anything like that. I don't want to give that impression. But a lot of the people he was associated with were. That is not up for debate. So basically, my point would be like, it is kind of this, it's almost like socialism for anti-communists, I guess is how you would put what he's developing, and specifically in an American context.
And in a sense, it sort of makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, considering the period, considering the cultural and social reaction of the political character of it in the United States post-war, it makes sense that those who would identify as socialists would sort of go out of their way to bend over backwards to make sure that everyone understood they were anti-Soviet, even if they were still socialist.
That's true. So it's, since this is the early 50s, this is the high point of the Red Scare, McCarthyism. The Socialist Party had been eclipsed by the communists for a long time, and they were supporting the Korean War. And but the Red Scare was so pervasive that Max Shachtman's group, which was under, there's no illusions that they support the Soviet Union at all in any respect, but they are on like the Attorney General's list of subversive organizations. Harrington himself has an FBI file. He would have been, if there had been some kind of national emergency in the 50s, he would have been thrown in jail with the rest of them. And again, this is someone who has no allegiance to the Soviet Union, none of them. So a lot of like they want to differentiate themselves from the Communist Party and the Soviet Union, but also want to make sure that they can have a voice in American society, and that does mean pretty much repeating the dominant ethos, even if the McCarthyites still want to haul them away too.
Okay, so now this we're talking the late 40s and into the early 50s. Now bring us forward a few years, Doug. How does Michael Harrington become the quote unquote man who discovered poverty?
So this is like the late 50s, early 60s. By this point, he's joined the Socialist Party, and he's actually rising to leadership in it. And he's doing a lot of speaking on campuses, and he's actually approached by some editors he knows to like, because he had written some articles on poverty, to write a book on it, and he is a little apprehensive about it. But eventually, he kind of decides to do that, and he writes this book. And The Other America is probably, in my opinion, one of his best books, in the sense it's very well written. It's very short. You can read it in an afternoon. It's only about 150 or so pages. And it it basically, it's meant to attack this idea that had been prevalent at the end of the 50s, that ideology no longer matters. We've overcome poverty. We live in an age of affluence. And he's saying, like, listen, no, there are tens of millions of people living in poverty in the United States. And he describes it. It's very journalistic, but it's very visceral, and everything. Now, what makes this book like kind of hit beyond, say, a wider audience, beyond like other tracks, is probably almost more the review of the book than the book itself. It was reviewed at either the New York Times, the New York Review Books, I forget which, but it was by Dwight MacDonald, who is one of the New York intellectuals. He wrote a very long and favorable review of the book. And this review of the book got to, it was basically got to the attention of John F. Kennedy, who was president at the time. And it's because Kennedy was thinking, let's do something about poverty. Let's do some kind of campaign. And he kind of found this. Now, so that actually helped. McDonald's book not only got attention to the book, but Kennedy got involved, was really excited about the book. Of course, Kennedy is killed, and Johnson is carrying on the campaign. And he actually brings Harrington in as an advisor on the Great Society programs. He's there talking, in the White House for a few weeks. It's actually the closest he ever comes to any kind of political power about how much to spend and everything. So basically, if Harrington, it's part of the reason why Harrington actually could get in the White House and talk about poverty and why his book could be picked up is because it's not actually written as a socialist critique of poverty, which is important to emphasize. He actually says, I don't want to do that. I don't want to emphasize like the criticism of capitalism or anything like that. He's basically offering a very moralistic, liberal criticism, and his proposals in the book are, we need to do the New Deal but better. We need to complete it. And people like Johnson had been like, the New Deal was their bread and butter politics, and so it's like, of course he would pick up on that. Obviously he wouldn't pick up on something that says like all power to workers councils or something like that. So Harrington, there's a convergence there between them. And Harrington himself, when it comes to the Great Society, is he was critical of it in the sense he didn't think it went far enough. He thought you could have done more. More money should have been put in, more programs should have been initiated. But that said, he would always defend the Great Society, and it was pretty much why, like, his big reason for supporting Johnson and whatnot. So, and Harrington himself was actually a bit annoyed at the fact that he was always introduced as the man who discovered poverty and wrote that book. He's like, I wrote all these other books, which is true, but none of them are as good as that one.
It's interesting because if you think about the timing of this, here comes this socialist, and forgive me for my voice, I'm still recovering from a cold here, but that Harrington becomes sort of this, I don't want to say figurehead, but this sort of figure associated with the issue of poverty at the time that, the early stages of like the baby boomers are beginning to come of age, the 60s beginning to take shape as far as what we think of as the quote unquote 60s, right? Counterculture, youth culture, all of these things. And so Harrington is kind of this interesting figure because while he comes from the left at a time when the left seems like it's insurgent, he's still apart from all of that. So talk a little bit about Harrington vis-a-vis the other issues of the day. How was Harrington with regard to young people, young left-wing activists, the Vietnam War? Where did he fall on these other issues that were defining for that generation?
So it's kind of interesting. Like, Harrington is he's only in his early 30s in the 1960s, and he was a rapidly rising figure in the Socialist Party, and he was actually very excited by some of the fervent on campuses, the civil rights movement, which he was involved with, and he counted Martin Luther King Jr. as a friend. Of course, he was also involved in red baiting in the civil rights movement as well. Um, but he was really excited about the possibilities of the new left. In fact, people like Tom Hayden looked up to Michael Harrington, and Harrington was involved in the founding of the Students for a Democratic Society, which is probably one of the most important organizations in the 1960s. Basically, SDS was originally the youth wing of the League of Industrial Democracy, which was connected to the Socialist Party. It's a long kind of organizational history there. So Harrington was connected with the parent body and everything. And pretty much they wanted to rebrand themselves. And Harrington was involved in this process that came out with the Port Huron Statement in 1962. And it's like, and if you actually read the Port Huron Statement, the full version, it encompasses a great many of Harrington's ideas. There's orientation toward the Democratic Party, the civil rights movement, the labor movement. It's explicitly anti-communist. And so on some levels, it's pretty much either a left liberalism or kind of a social democratic manifesto. But Harrington himself actually had a lot of problems with the Pure Huron Statement because and SDS at that moment, because he thought that they were insufficiently anti-communist, to put it bluntly. Because even though the Pure Huron Statement rejects the Soviet Union, and they also reject the Cold War, and they actually put a little more emphasis on the blame of the United States for starting it, which is, for Harrington, that's a no-no. pretty much you have to be anti-communist. And at the founding of the SDS, they actually had an observer from the Young Communist League who was like an 18-year-old kid. And for Harrington, this was equivalent to being, having Joseph Stalin in the same room. So pretty much, he is infuriated that he thinks that these SDS is going too far, and he pretty much brings people like Tom Hayden in and pretty much puts them on trial, and it's interrogating them for being soft on communism, changes the locks on their offices, and so people Hayden is actually heartbroken about this. It's like the only time I've ever felt any sympathy for Tom Hayden. But eventually, cooler heads prevail, people like Norman Thomas, and Harrington kind of makes up with SDS in 1962. But he will apologize for his behavior at that event. But Harrington says something else. It's like, even if we didn't break over this, if I had behaved differently, the break would have come, and the break would have come over Vietnam. Because when the Vietnam War really picks up in 1964, 65, SDS is really involved in the anti-war movement. They're holding demonstrations. And I do want to emphasize here, although SDS is opposed to the war, it's not like I don't want, there's, Harrington himself is not so much like, let's bomb the hell out of them. The issue is not their opposition to the war. If you read Harrington's writings, he is very clear he's opposed to the war. The issue of division is over how they oppose the war. SDS is willing to do things like hold demonstrations, burn draft cards, militant actions. They're not willing to no-toe to the Democratic Party. They're even willing to have communists at their demonstrations and to support victory for the Vietnamese communists. For Harrington, you can't do that. You have to stay respectable. You can't embarrass your Democratic allies, because you can't get kicked out of that. That's where change happens for him. You can't do things like burn draft cards or break the law, and you certainly can't, have communists in your demonstrations or support the National Liberation Front, because obviously for him, both sides, but mostly the communists, are to blame for the Vietnam War. So this is the division. And eventually it does lead to a split between SDS eventually formally disavows its parent body, and Harrington is left, adrift at that point. And he is aghast at like the currents of radicalism that come up in the 1960s, Black nationalism, the women's movement, anything that has a revolutionary tinge to it. He sees it as the new Jacobinism. It's the proto-totalitarianism in coming up. And people like Irving Howe, who's a friend of Harrington, writes these diatribes against the new left, for embracing like Che Guevara and Marxism, Leninism. They think they should stay respectable and whatnot. So pretty much at Harrington, he is initially very supportive of the new left, but as it turns to revolution, he is very much against it. Although I do want to emphasize he always wants to work with moderates in the new left.
We're going to head to break in a minute, but before we do, I want to just talk a little bit about some of the voices on the left at the time who were opposing Harrington, who made very explicit their oppositions and their criticisms. You highlight a couple of them in the book. I'd like to ask you about them. One of them, who's close to a lot of our hearts here at Counterpunch, Peter Camejo. Peter Camejo has some pretty interesting criticisms of Michael Harrington. So tell us a little bit about Peter Camejo, maybe one or two others who had critiques of Harrington at that time from his left.
Sure. So Peter Camejo at the time was a member of the Socialist Workers' Party. So they were a Trotskyist organization at the time. And he was running for vice president's, their vice presidential candidate. And this is actually 76. It's a little after, but he is pretty much saying to Harrington, like, you are a Democrat. You're not a socialist. You are just thinking that you can work with more, people who are less racist, less sexist, to somehow to get rid of the, racism and sexism. So he is very much against like Harrington's like electoral and reformist orientation. And there's a good series of debates between them on those questions, where Harrington at least does respond to those points. Another person who kind of from Harrington's left, who passed away a few years ago, was David McReynolds, who is a socialist, a member of the Socialist Party USA. He was a longtime pacifist. I think he ran for president a few times, and he was aghast at the Socialist Party's pretty much non-committal to oppose the Vietnam War. So those are just two people, but anyone who was in also, if you're looking to like the revolutionary groups that came out of SDS, none of them would have anything to do with Harrington. They thought he was too reformist, that he was soft on liberalism, soft on imperialism as well.
Well, and I bring that up, of course, because it is so directly parallels some of the conversations we have today about electoralism and the role of the Democratic Party and the role of the left vis-a-vis, U.S. politics. And many of those criticisms of Harrington and his devotion to electoralism are many of the same criticisms we hear today.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, he actually has a full-blown strategy. It's something called realignment, and that's what he basically says, that there's this new class that's emerged after World War II, and it's these technicians, these bureaucrats, these students who are this new petty bourgeois, however you want to put it. And he says in Eastern Europe, all these people essentially became the administrators of totalitarianism. But in the United States, that there's a possibility that they could become the foundation for a new majority. And he basically thinks the new class should get together with the civil rights movement, moderates in the women's movement, and also the labor bureaucracy. Because he says, unlike in Western Europe that has, socialist parties of whatever sort, it's like that didn't happen in the U.S. There was some, he thinks that a secret socialist or labor party was formed by the AFL-CIO, but it took place under the tent of the Democratic Party. So he thinks socialist politics can only really happen with engagement of the Democratic Party. And he basically wants this new majority to transform the Democratic Party into a European-style social democratic formation. And all the racists and capitalists go to the Republicans. That this new Democratic Party will somehow make a welfare state and then somehow make socialism in the long term. And I bring this up because, and Harrington, first of all, says this is the only place where a beginning can happen. This is like the whole linchpin for his strategy, is to transform the Democratic Party. And if you look at a lot of debates today, even if people don't know who Harrington is or they don't reference him or whatever, how much of those debates are basically like, you know what? Yeah, you have all these great ideas about socialism or whatever, but we have to do something here in the Democratic Party by electing a better class of Democrats, by, primarying this person or pushing this policy legislation. And a lot of this, it just echoes Harrington. He just kind of actually articulated it, very, very well, even if it didn't work out in practice at all.
Let's take a break. On the other side of the break, I want to pick up right there talking about the lasting legacy of Harrington, how it has imprinted itself in some ways on the organization that he left behind. And on the left, broadly speaking, we are chatting with Doug Greene. Again, the book, you should get yourself a copy, A Failure of Vision, Michael Harrington and the Limits of Democratic Socialism, published by Zero Books. Get a copy for yourself, get a copy for your friends, and we will be right back.
You're asking what is socialism and what it really means. It's equal rights for every man, regardless of his strength. So don't let no one fool you. Joshua said, listen as I tell you. Joshua said, no man are better than none. Socialism is love between man and man. Socialism is love for your brother. Socialism is linking hearts and hands. Would you believe me? Poverty and hunger is what we're fighting. Socialism is sharing with your sister. Socialism is people pulling together. Would you believe me? Love and togetherness. That's what it means. Mr. got a bigger trembling in his shoes, saying he's got a lot to lose. Don't want to hear about sufferer at all. Joshua said, one man have too many, while too many have too little. Socialism don't stand for that, don't stand for that at all. Socialism is love for your brother. Socialism is linking hearts and heads. Poverty and hunger is what we're fighting. Socialism is sharing with your sisters. Socialism is people pulling together. Would you believe me? Love and togetherness. That's what it means. Socialism is love for your brother. Socialism is linking hearts and hands. Poverty and hunger is what we're fighting. Socialism is sharing with your sister. Do you believe me?
And we are back chatting with Doug Greene. Again, the book, A Failure of Vision, Michael Harrington and the Limits of Democratic Socialism. Again, this is the part of the reason we're having the conversation is not to air opinions or grievances about DSA or about any organization. It's about understanding the nature of the landscape of the left in the United States, to the extent that such a thing even exists, and to really understand how some of these historical threads have brought us forward to today. Because, of course, as I don't know that we said this specifically, but as we were alluding to in the first part of the conversation, DSA really exploded in popularity and in the public imagination after the 2016 election, the election of Donald Trump, etc. And so it bears, looking at what this organization means, where the politics come from. And so with that being said, Doug, I want to just jump right back into what we were talking about before the break. You were hitting on some of the ways in which Harrington's ideas continue to influence DSA today. Can you flesh out a little bit more? What are some of those competing tendencies that we see both within DSA back then and then that we see reported on all the time today?
Right. So back in Harrington's day, DSA was founded in 1982 as a fusion of two groups, and Harrington was its undisputed leader. And they pretty much, their big thing was to basically support the Democrats. So interestingly, even though Harrington supported some kind, on paper anyway, supported like insurgent movements, he didn't support the Rainbow Coalition in 1984, which was kind of the best shot that ever happened for realignment. He did support them in 1988, although that didn't really go anywhere. He was probably more in tune with supporting the establishment candidates, whether Mondale or Dukakis. And he's probably the only person in the world who was excited about the prospects of Michael Dukakis, I might add. But after he died, it was 1989. So this is, Berlin Wall comes down, the Soviet Union collapses, and this hits like every left-wing groups in the United States very hard. And DSA formally abandons realignment sometime in the 90s, but they're kind of like this inside-outside strategy for a while. So, at one point in 2000, they support like 3 candidates, but mostly they support the Democrats in presidential elections. And when you come to 2016, first of all, they get some supporters new members who supported Bernie Sanders, but they really exploded after Trump. And, they went from something like under 10,000 to, again, around 100,000 today. So in terms of like where you see Harrington's legacy in DSA, well, there are a few places. First is a magazine called Jacobin, which was founded, I think, around 2010 or 11. I forget the year. And the founder of Jacobin, Bhaskar Sankara, counts Harrington as an influence very much. And I don't want to. Jacobin is not strictly like a DSA org magazine, but it does have a lot of DSA contributors. But if you read like Bhaskar Sankara's articles in Jacobin, a lot of it is just repeating like the type of Harrington type strategy of supporting the Democrats and whatnot. So In 2016 and 2020, they were pretty much gung ho for Bernie Sanders. There was like literally no criticism at all in any way. So you see a lot of that type of influence in terms of what Jacobin is saying. And I do want to, so the other way about Harrington's influence, and before I get to that, DSA is not, completely like a monolith or completely unchanging. So after 2016, with the new influx of members, they left the Socialist International, they embraced boycott, divestment, sanctions against Israel. And you've had all kinds of study groups in there. You've had, with Marx, Trotsky or whatever you, and you've even had, mutual aid and whatnot, and all kinds of caucuses. But a lot of their activity is like, it's just like, it's electing Democrats. AOC, who they have like about 100 or so members who are elected to some office as Democrats, and a lot of that Harrington would have no problem with at all. And I have to ask, like, how real is your commitment to boycott, divestment, sanctions when you vote, when you count as your members, Jamal Bowman or AOC who vote for the IDF or to fund it, or you campaign for Bernie Sanders who's voted for that as well. So there is that. So I actually say, like, I don't think, I think 90+% of DSA members don't know who Harrington is, have never read him or anything. What I will say is, I think in the organization as a whole, and in a lot of what it does, is Harringtonism is basically this unspoken common sense, what Althusser might call the spontaneous ideology. And so, because it's, voting for Democrats, a reformist vision of socialism, this kind of opportunism that is very prevalent, that's all kind of in tune with Harrington. And you honestly don't really need a big theoretical apparatus to justify that. That's like in the era of American politics. DSA is just kind of expressing that in its own unique way. Now there are, there. I bring up the Jamal Bowman because that's a very recent thing with DSA. Is he's their congressman who voted for like the Iron Dome, and among members that there's been, some pushback to that. Even calls to censure or expel him. But the fact that Bowman is in DSA and has not been removed, that's kind of the lingering influence of Harrington, who was himself a very, fierce Zionist. You know,
So I think it's important to ask not only, where do we critique Harrington and DSA, but what does it represent? What did Harrington understand about solidarity, international solidarity in those days? Because it's hard to see where the socialist internationalism comes in based on his views vis-a-vis Vietnam or the communist bloc or what have you. So how did Harrington view socialism as an international sort of project, and to what extent does that view shape how DSA sees international solidarity?
so in terms of how Harrington saw socialism, it's worth getting into what he thought of third world revolutions, which it's a very strange view. On the one hand, he thinks like that there can be no development under capitalism, because of the way the international market, etc., is structured. But he thought like any attempt to move past it would basically lead to totalitarianism. So he pretty much says, people in the third world need to just kind of be nice and push for like some kind of international New Deal and everything. So he was pretty he was not a fan of pretty much most third world revolutionary attempts. When he went to Nicaragua in the 1980s, he's like, I couldn't help feel sympathy, but I didn't want to look at this like, the way fellow travelers looked at the Soviet Union, like that's an issue when that country was under imperialist attack and all that. So he was, he pretty much saw third world socialist attempts as foredoomed. He was, he was opposed to the, Palestinian struggle. He was much more uh, sympathetic to Western European, Scandinavian social democrats and the Israeli Labor Party. He saw that as much more what he saw that as much more in line with his politics, and he he looked like, it's very strange to me because like this was someone who like would call like Che Guevara a totalitarian, but saw Robert McNamara, who was at one point head of the IMF or the World Bank, one of those organizations, as someone truly committed to the poor. Someone who had quite a history in Vietnam, murdering lots of people. So Harrington was very much, you could call, he was not completely, gung ho all the time. He supported detente with the Soviet Union by the 80s and perestroika and that kind of stuff. But this was someone who had, counted these European social democrats as his allies. Like at one point, he was at a meeting of the Socialist International in Peru. It's in 1986. And they're meeting there while the Peruvian president is carrying out a counterinsurgency campaign and its government is massacring imprisoned guerrillas at the same time. It's like, if that's what you consider compatible with socialism, I'm not sure. In terms of DSA today and international solidarity, it's kind of strange. On the one hand, I'd almost call it schizophrenic. So you have their members who are in elected offices, and they sometimes will tweet okay things, but they vote for these bills supporting the IDF, democracy change in Venezuela, scare quotes, and the U.S. military. AOC has done that. Sometimes, though, they have members who have gone on like visits to South America and published statements in support of lifting the blockade on Cuba or what have you. But again, it's like eventually these two positions really cannot coexist for long term. You can't say that you're opposed to U.S. imperialism while your most prominent members vote to fund it. So it'd be interesting to see how that gets resolved. I'm a historian, so I don't like making too many predictions on the future, but I know that does come up in like debates around Bauman that have happened in DSA as of late.
So I'm going to ask you to strain yourself, if you can, and really see if you can tell us, is there anything useful about Harrington's legacy? Not only, I mean, you can obviously answer this question by saying that he's a foil and using him as an example of how not to think, but also, I mean, I do think that it's fair to say that this is one of the most significant individual figures on the left in the United States and still, the second half of the 20th century. And is there anything that we could take from him that's useful?
Um, my short answer would be no, but my longer answer is I think as a writer, Harrington's actually a very good writer. Like he is actually very good at communicating ideas and making abstract concepts like comprehensible. I just think what he makes comprehensible and accessible is just not very good as a writer. I actually did like a book he wrote. It's called The Politics of God's Funeral. It's kind of like an intellectual history of what happens after religion stops being the guiding force in the Western world. I actually like that in terms of a lot of its intellectual history. I don't like any of the political prescriptions in it, but I I do think a big part of the reason like why it was worth looking at Harrington is as a foil, because he's not a fool. He's not a stupid man at all. He's very intelligent, very widely read, and he really is good at taking a lot of these ideas and actually formulating them into a system. And I do think a big part of it is the foil, but also just like the lasting influence of him is important to how that kind of socialism almost gets to be as close to mainstream, I guess, as it can in this country. And in that sense, like that's worth looking at, like how that happens. Like it's worth looking also at just how someone who was initially committed on very good grounds to fighting poverty, on fighting oppression, kind of gets into a position where that they're defending, like, American imperialism. How does that happen to somebody? How do we understand that? I mean, so my my longer answer is, like, there are certain books of his, like, I found, like, interesting to read, but in terms of, like, a political practice and a theory, I'm actually for pretty much tossing Harrington. Um, Pretty much, I read him, so, like, a lot of people don't have to, because but also just understanding, like, how the pull of the dominant ideology in politics works on a person. Because again, Harrington was not someone who was just some malicious mustache twirling villain. I think he was genuinely believed what he said. I just, but how you get there, and you just can kind of see that because it does happen to many leftists today. Like, you think, I'm going to change the system from the inside, and it changes them. And you can kind of see that on Harrington on, like, a larger scale, I guess.
For any of the people who might be coming across your book and maybe this podcast, and who have either already had experiences with DSA or were curious about it or whatever, I guess what I don't want to say advice, but what information would you want to convey? Not so much your opinion about DSA, which is obviously not terribly high, and as far as a political organization today, but what would you want people to look at? What would you want people to consider about as they formulate their own ideas about socialism in the United States in the 21st century, given the overlapping crises that we're facing both in this country and globally? If it's not Harrington and it's not the DSA as it exists today, what should people be thinking about, Doug?
I mean, my my first advice would, of course, be to read my book for understanding Harrington. But beyond that, I think some of the biggest things that we can do on, for people who are wondering about where to go or what to, or what have you, is educate yourself. It's so, like, the amount of people I see who can't get, like, basic socialist Marxist ideas, like, down. I think it's important to, like, you study, go back to, the Marx, Engels, Lenin, all of them, but also to keep your ear on the ground, find like-minded comrades, try to develop a principled, politics that is flexible enough to intervene in the real world, and to understand history. Like, like, ideas and politics don't just appear ex nihilo, that there are material conditions that shape them. And if we understand that history, we can kind of work through, in a lot of ways, like, how to develop a more radical politics. And I think on some level, it does mean kind of, I rejecting the type of politics that Harrington put in play, that he was advocating, which were very much constrained to what the ruling class thinks is possible. And this, it sounds very cliche, but, think outside that box, reject that box, because if you are not bound by what is deemed possible by liberals and social democrats, it kind of opens up a whole new slew of possibilities. I think something else I recommend, aside from studying theory, history, is find like-minded comrades, work through it together, and, forge your own path. Don't let the election cycle determine your politics. And also, I think if we're going to have socialism in the US in some way, that it does mean actually rejecting the Democratic Party and trying to develop our own organizations, mutual aid, political parties, etc., that are not beholden to the type of imperial interests that Harrington thought were essential.
I think that's very well said. Thank you for that. Again, the book, everybody needs to get a copy. There's so many people in your life that probably should read this. A Failure of Vision, Michael Harrington and the Limits of Democratic Socialism from Zero Books. Doug Greene is the author. Also pick up a copy of his other book. This one is also a great read, Communist Insurgent, Blanqui's Politics of Revolution. Follow Doug on social media. He is a wealth of information. Doug Greene, thanks for the book. Thanks for the conversation and coming back to Counterpunch. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Listeners, as always, thank you again for the continued support, and we will talk again next time.